You're watching the English newscast here on Future Television. I'm Linda Tamim, and these are today's top stories. Former Prime Minister Saad Hariri holds crucial talks with Parliament Speaker Nabih Berri in his latest round of consultations over the presidential crisis. Prime Minister Tamam Slam blames the government for the pollution of the Litani River, calling for immediate action to stop the environmental catastrophe before it's too late. And more than 9,000 people are killed in a year of Russian air raids in Syria as fierce fighting near the besieged city of Aleppo continues. Former Prime Minister Saad Hariri has held crucial talks with Parliament Speaker Nabih Berri in his latest round of consultations over the presidential crisis. The meeting occurred hours after Lebanon's Defense Minister Samir Muqbil extended the term of Army Commander General Jean Ahwaji. The Future Movement leader met with Berri at the latter's residence in Ain Tine, where the talks were also attended by Berri's top political aide, Finance Minister Ali Hassan Khalil, as well as Hariri's Chief of Staff Nader Hariri. Neither leader spoke to the media, and a statement only said they discussed the current situation and the presidential issue. Berri was the latest official to be visited by Hariri, who has conducted a flurry of activity aimed at accelerating the election of a new president. Parliament Speaker Nabih Berri has denied a personal feud between him and presidential hopeful MP Michel Aoun, saying the national dialogue was the only path to salvage the nation. Berri's statement came after an article was published in Al Akhbar newspaper in which the writer Al Akhbar editor-in-chief Brahim Al Amin claimed the speaker was blocking Aoun's presidential bid. Amin claimed in his article that Berri fears that Aoun will not be able to gather the Lebanese if the latter reaches the Babda Palace, and he believes the Change and Reform chief could destabilize the composition of Lebanon, resulting in a rivalry between Muslims in the country. Prime Minister Tamam Slam has blamed the government for the pollution of the Litani River, calling for immediate action to stop the environmental catastrophe before it is too late. During a speech at Beirut's UNESCO Palace to launch a campaign to clean up the Litani River, Salam said the first step towards rescuing the vital water resource is to reorganize the constitutional institutions and to elect a president. In fact, the more than 2-year presidential vacuum has paralyzed Lebanon's executive and legislative branches. Salam praised Speaker Nabih Berri for what he said were efforts to preserve the river, calling on other political factions and municipalities across the country to follow in his footsteps. The implementation of a campaign to protect the Litani River will begin on October 23rd after the World Bank announced the approval of a $55 million loan for a project to address major sources of pollution in the river. More than 9,000 people, including nearly 4,000 civilians, have been killed in a year of Russian air raids in Syria as fierce fighting near the besieged city of Aleppo continues. Russia launched an air campaign on September 30th of last year in support of Syrian government forces, and a military intervention that has been widely credited with helping turn the balance of power in favor of President Bashar al-Assad. Doctors Without Borders appealed to the Syrian government and its Russian ally to stop bombing rebel-held eastern Aleppo, warning they were provoking a bloodbath among civilians in the city. The United Nations has warned that a humanitarian catastrophe was unfolding in Aleppo, unlike any witnessed so far in Syria's brutal 5-year war. The UN says only around 35 doctors remain in eastern Aleppo, where an estimated 250,000 people have been under siege by government forces since early September. The United Nations aid chief says Syria is the ultimate human shame, with the U.S. close to suspending talks with Russia on a ceasefire. Paul Chapman reports.
These were the scenes in the Syrian city of Aleppo on Wednesday after airstrikes that hit 2 of its hospitals. Hospital workers said Russian or Syrian warplanes were responsible. At the same time, ground forces intensified their assault against the rebel-held sector of the city. At least 250,000 people are trapped there since the collapse of the US-Russian brokered ceasefire. United Nations aid chief Stephen O'Brien described it as the ultimate human shame.
The only remaining deterrent, it seems, is that there will be real accountability in the court of world opinion and disgust. Goodness knows, nothing else seems to be working to stop this deliberate, gratuitous carnage of lives lost and smashed. Everything possible.
Syria's ambassador to the UN denied government forces were attacking civilians.
We don't do that. Those who did it are the terrorists, and the Americans and their British allies and French allies.
US Secretary of State John Kerry says Washington is close to suspending talks with Russia on a ceasefire. Moscow's vowing to press on with the assault on Aleppo, where victory for the government would be a likely turning point in the conflict. On Thursday, the Pope told a meeting of aid agencies working in Syria and Iraq the world must not look away and that further violence will not attain peace.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will reportedly hold a telephone conversation with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry to discuss separating Syria's moderate opposition from the group formerly known as the Nusra Front. Russian news agencies quoted Lavrov as saying a ceasefire deal on Syria that Russia agreed with the United States was still working. He also said Russia was not using banned weapons in Syria and demanded evidence from those accusing Moscow of hitting civilian targets. Lavrov added that comments by the United States State Department that Russian interests or even cities could come under attack from militant Islamists if Moscow continued airstrikes in Syria were unacceptable. Coming up next, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte appears to compare himself with Adolf Hitler. I'll tell you more after the break. Welcome back. Saudi Arabia has warned of disastrous consequences from a United States law allowing 9/11 victims to sue the kingdom in a major spike in tension between the long-standing allies. The warning came after the U.S. Congress voted overwhelmingly to override President Barack Obama's veto of the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, known as JUSTA. JUSTA allows attack survivors and relatives of terrorism victims to pursue cases against foreign governments in U.S. federal court and to demand compensation if such governments are proven to bear some responsibility for attacks on U.S. soil. In opposing the law, Obama said it would harm U.S. interests by undermining the principle of sovereign immunity, opening up the U.S. to private lawsuits over its military missions abroad. Israelis, along with several world leaders, gathered in Jerusalem for the funeral of former President Shimon Peres. U.S. President Barack Obama, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, French President François Hollande, and other world leaders were among those attending. Speaking at the ceremony, Obama said the attendance of Abbas was a gesture and a reminder of the unfinished business of peace. The United Nations has warned that around 100,000 people were trapped in the South Sudanese town of Yei, where they were facing serious shortages of food and medicine. Yei is situated some 150 kilometers southwest of Juba, near the borders with Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and until recently had been spared much of the violence plaguing the world's youngest nation. But the security situation there has deteriorated rapidly since July. The UN Refugee Agency said now around 100,000 people, many of whom had fled into the town in search of safety, could no longer leave after government troops surrounded the area. Moving on to the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte has appeared to compare himself with Adolf Hitler, saying he would be happy to slaughter millions of drug addicts, just like Nazi Germany killed 3 million Jews. While Hitler's victims were innocent people, Duterte said his targets were all criminals and that getting rid of them would finish the drug problem of his country and save the next generation from perdition. In his words,
Hitler massacred 3 million Jews. Now, there's a 3 million drug addicts. There are. At least, if Germany had Hitler, the Philippines would have, but, my victims, I would like to be all criminals to finish the problem of my country and save the next generation from perdition. Kayong US, EU, you can call me anything. But I was never into, or I am never into hypocrisy like you. Close your doors, it's winter time, there are migrants escaping from the Middle East, you allow them to rot, and then you're worried about the deaths of about 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. You are portrayed or pictured to be a cousin of Hitler, and yet do not even bother to find out, to investigate if.
Italian police have recovered 2 paintings by the Dutch artist Vincent van Gogh in Naples that were stolen nearly 14 years ago in the Netherlands. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam said the artworks, which were stolen in 2002, had been removed from their frames but appeared largely undamaged. The museum said the paintings were recovered during a massive continuing investigation commissioned by the Italian Public Prosecution's Department against Organized Crime. It is not yet known when the paintings, which have an estimated value in the tens of millions of euros, will be returned to the Dutch capital. 2 men were given prison sentences for the robbery, although they had pleaded not guilty. This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a recap of our top stories. Former Prime Minister Saad Hariri holds crucial talks with Parliament Speaker Nabih Berri in his latest round of consultations over the presidential crisis. Prime Minister Tamam Slam blames the government for the pollution of the Litani River, calling for immediate action to stop the environmental catastrophe before it is too late. And more than 9,000 people are killed in a year of Russian air raids in Syria as fierce fighting near the besieged city of Aleppo continues. Those are your top stories for this Friday. I'm Linda Tanim and I wish you all a very nice weekend.